So this class is going to be a little bit different than the previous class on Jewish history. Last time we talked about kind of more of a bigger picture of the Jewish people and more of a macro. What does God want from us? How is He leading us? What's the direction? What are the trends? And what are the stories and the major themes and events that happened to the Jewish people from Abraham till the times of the destruction of the first temple? What we're going to try to do today is actually do from the destruction of the first temple, the beginning of exile, because it's a time of major upheaval and transition for the Jewish people, and primarily in one area more than any other area, and that is the area of Torah. The Jewish people have been forever linked with Torah, and you kind of could track Jewish history in a very similar course to the history of Torah. And we know, as I mentioned last time, that the history of the Jewish people is more about the individuals and the people and the great leaders than it is about the events. And the great leaders means the great Torah scholars. So in a sense, if we wanted to get really a picture of where the heart and soul of Jewish people are throughout history, we can look at the Torah transmission process and the major turns that it takes from the time of the first temple being destroyed to the present time, and we get also the flavor of the Jewish people, what actually happened to them during those times. But more importantly, it teaches us also about what the Torah is and how did it develop. What are the definitions of the various terms you'll hear? You hear a lot of terms about what Torah, about the Mishnah, about Oral Torah, about Talmud, about Maimonides, Shulchan Aruch, all these things, where do they fit in and how did it all develop? So that's what we're going to try to do today. I think we might have mentioned this last time. The importance of accuracy in the transmission of the Torah, it cannot be understated. We're coming with a claim. The claim the Jewish people have forever given to the world is that we have the will of God and in its most accurate form, and that's the way we live. The Jewish people have been the people of God because we are governed by the laws of God. The Torah. Now, the second there is any mistake or any deviation or any perversion of the Torah, then kind of the Jewish people and what we stand for ceases as well. Yeah.
So that begs the question: all these different branches of Judaism that reconstructive and whatever.
Well, so that's a very modern question.
Okay.
Your question is a very, very modern question, because if I rewind 200 years, if it was now not 2014, rather 1814, you would never ask the question. You know why? Because there weren't any.
One thing.
There weren't any. Now, historically, the movements that sprang up in the 19th and 20th century are not the only examples of schisms, fractures amongst the Jewish people. We've had famously in the times of the destruction of the Second Temple, you remember the names Sadducees, the Essenes, these groups. In the 9th century, 9th or 7th century, we have the Karaites. So it's not a new phenomenon where there's a group that says we want to have a different brand of Judaism. That's not a new thing. It's very rare, exceedingly rare, but it's different than, let's say, the Christians and the many different splinter sects that are under the same umbrella of Christianity or Islam. That Islam has really two different religions, and the Sunnis and the Shias, all the way from day one, where it's vastly different, and perpetuated different religions, as opposed to the Sadducees. While they may have made a major upheaval amongst the Jewish people, but they're gone now. And the Karaites are almost gone now. There's like Karaite temple, I think one of them in LA. But it's a non-factor, even though it was huge at its time. And you know what? The early reform is also gone. There's no such thing as early reform today. So the reform movement, in a certain sense, is gone.
Because I don't know why people always say to me, oh, you have so many different ways. And then I turn around and say, you have so many different churches. What difference is?
Yeah,
it's just to deflect the question because it's annoying to me.
Even if we take the Jewish people and look at them as three different religions, Reformists or Orthodox or Reconstructionists or humanitarian or whatever people like to brand their Judaism is. First of all, it's at its core, we kind of agree on almost every matter, and second of all, like our basic texts, for example, the Torah. We have an accurate text of the Torah. No one disagrees. There's almost no deviation. A document that's 3,300 years old, and there's almost no deviation. There's no words that are different in my Torah and anyone's Torah, as opposed to, let's say, the New Testament, so to speak, or the Christian Bible. There's 2,000 variations, and there's gross mistakes and just terrible mistakes. And of course, the Quran is no different. The Quran just has major gaps and major places people in the wrong place.
So the difference of us would be like in prayer, or how the different prayer books, because I've seen
it's very minor.
But you're saying Torah.
It's very minor, and it's a passing phase. It's a passing phase, and if the differences that would exist in the various Jewish communities today are much more narrow than they were 100 years ago. In 100 years ago, like, no one would dare walk into a reform shul with a kippah, with yarmulke. No one. That was like literally the worst thing you could possibly do. But that's not true anymore. And there's been a readoption of Torah in the reform world, and a readoption of Israel. But Israel was a no-no up to 1937, where they adopted it. So it's the difference is, while they may have been very big in the 19th century and early 20th century, kind of narrowed now. So yes, there's still differences, but it's not quite as minor. So it's more, I look at it more, if you look at the big picture, as a passing phase, and something that we've been through before, and we weathered and we survived as a single individual intact nation, and we'll do that as well with this, this current phase of different offshoots of. Now, that being said, I think Reconstructionist is really a totally different religion. It's not even based on any principles and anything like that.
I thought that's just
it's just nonsense. It's nonsense. That's nonsense. But you think of a Reform conservative, it's the core principles of believing in God, and believing in Torah, and believing in the narrative, and the responsibilities, and what it means to be Jewish. Those things is very little different. Now, with regards to actual observance, obviously that's where you'll find the major difference. But a different means, and you found that forever, that's been ever present, where you have some Jews that believe one thing and behave a different way. That's very common. But the ideology is the same. Even though the practice is different, it's still united in philosophy and ideology. Okay, where were we? I lost track of where we were. Okay, so that's why the importance of the accurate transmission of the Torah cannot be understated, because the second we have a mistake or a deviation or some sort of hiccup in our transmission process, then the entire vision of what the Jewish people are and what we stand for is derailed. Now, in ancient times, right, we don't have a book of laws, really. We have the written Torah, but we don't have, everything was orally transmitted. So that means that all you have really as a physical document is the Torah. And the Torah doesn't really tell you how to behave as a Jew. The Torah is more broad strokes. The Torah is an outline. The Torah is a framework for what it means to be a Jew. But to actually live as a Jew, you can't do that. You don't know what Shabbos is if you read the Torah. It says don't do work. Well, what does that mean? What constitutes work? It doesn't tell you. It gives you a very broad picture of the overall, like I say, it's a framework for the Torah and what it actually means, but the Almighty chose to give it to us in oral fashion. So when the Jewish people were at Mount Sinai, they were studying Torah the entire year that they were there. What were they studying? They weren't studying the written Torah. In fact, they didn't get the written Torah until 40 years later. So what were they studying? They were studying the oral Torah. What does that mean? The laws, the applications, and what it actually means. How does Jew live? You're Jewish now, right? You're no longer just a tribe. You're a nation under God, obviously, right? The Almighty took us out of Egypt, and He transferred this servitude and dedication that we had to Pharaoh, our master, to God. God's now the master, and now you have to act as a Jew. We encamp at Mount Sinai. We're there for a year. We learn what it means to be a Jew. We learn what it is to be a Jew. We begin practicing as Jews, and we begin teaching our children what it means to be a Jew. And from day one, there is already an entire system in place to ensure that everything is transmitted 100% accurately. For example, we read a couple of weeks ago in the Torah about the Sanhedrin. It's a word that you'll hear a lot. Sanhedrin was, think of it as the Supreme Court of Jewish law. And their job was to be the voice of unified central authority for Jewish law and Jewish policy. And whenever there was a disagreement, whenever there was a problem, there was an argument, one rabbi in the neighborhood said this, and one rabbi said that, they had a disagreement, their oral law wasn't so clear, they would march up to the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin had 71 of the greatest Jewish scholars, plus an additional 69 scholars in waiting.
This is at Sinai.
Well, this began even at Sinai.
Yeah.
Yes. We'll get to when it ended. And they would mediate, and they would present the argument, and that was a flowing, fluid transmission and uninterrupted for 1,500 years. For 1,500 years, there was a court comprised of the greatest and brightest of the Jewish scholars, and it was never ceased and never interrupted. And from there we got guidance, from there we got instruction, and from there we clarified any disagreements that may arise. Additionally, for the first, 900 years after Sinai, the Jewish people were blessed by great sages that were also prophets. Prophet means that they're able to communicate with God. More precisely, God communicates with them. Now, we are right now a non-profit organization, the Jewish people. We don't know what it means to have a prophet. But back in the day, there was a prophet, and you would go to him and ask your question. You would say, hey, what do I do? Do I do this business deal or not? What field should I get into? Right? I lost my iPod. Where is it? That was the kind of way they lived. They lived in an atmosphere where God and His presence was everywhere. They were open miracles, and no one flinched at it, just like no one flinches when they see a helicopter flying in the sky. That's a miracle. How is it not falling down? We're so used to it, it's not a big deal anymore. Prophecy was everywhere, ever present. Supreme knowledge of Torah was everywhere. It was ubiquitous. No one flinched at it. Now, just think about it this way. Imagine if 2,000 years ago, a helicopter flew over Rome. People would freak out. Just like they would freak out if, imagine today, a prophet walked in and knew what you were holding in your pocket, right? And could tell you where your lost jewelry, God forbid if you lost it, is, And Saul went over to Samuel and said, "Where's my donkey?" Why? Because that's what normal people did. It's like Google. It's Google. You want answers, you go to the prophet. And the prophets were also a very important stopgap, protective measure to ensure that the Torah was transmitted accurately. The prophet was there to help answer questions. And when there was when they didn't know, they would be able to communicate with God. We have the books of Ezekiel, we have the books of Jeremiah, Isaiah. These are famous prophets that were in communication with God. To us, it's a foreign idea. It's bizarre. It's strange because we can't conceptualize such spiritual greatness. But this was commonplace then. And this was another method to ensure that no mistakes were perpetuated. Additionally, there was something called the Urim V'Tumim. The Urim V'Tumim, in the first temple period, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, had a breastplate on which there were 12 stones. And the 12 stones had the names of the 12 Shvatim. And when there was a question, sometimes the Jewish people would ask a question and they wouldn't know the answer, and they would go to the Kohen Gadol and would say, "Tell us what the answer is." And the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol and the letters of the 12 tribes would illuminate the answer. This was common, right? And that's why we have absolutely no record of any disagreement, of any misunderstanding, of any inaccuracy in transmission of the Torah for the first 900 years. Because we had A, prophecy, B, we had the Urim V'Tumim in the first temple, C, we had the Sanhedrin.
When was the Sanhedrin formed, Rabbi?
Moses formed the Sanhedrin.
Okay.
Now let me ask you this, who decided that these 71 plus 69?
Moses
were the
appointed them.
smallest?
Moses appointed them, and the Talmud describes what they actually had 69 apprentices, but these were like the next in line, and they would find someone who's the greatest scholar that's not part of the group. And when someone would die, the Sanhedrin, then the next one in line out of 69
Right.
would go up, everyone move up a spot, so to
They
speak.
write down, like a complaint, this is the complaint, this is how we figured
Well,
out.
we
the
have
answer.
that's a good point. They wrote it down. It was never canonized. Now, the word canonized is a very important word, because the fact that you and I write Torah, it doesn't make it holy. It's not sanctified. It's Torah. It's a very holy thing, but it's not binding for the entire Jewish people. Right? Nothing binding about it. The Torah, right? Moses gave us the Torah. This is binding. This is canonized. This is the Torah. Right? There's no negotiation about it at all. And now, over the course of that 900 years that we're talking about, a lot of people wrote Torah. A lot of people wrote down, organized for themselves or for their community, Torah ideas, oral Torah. They organized themselves, but it was never canonized till the Mishnah.
It's kind of like officiate. Is that
It
what
was
you mean?
yes,
It's like
yes,
officiate.
and there was finally stamped with approval of the entire Jewish people, so to speak. And we see this several times throughout Jewish history, and the Jewish history we're discussing now, the history of the Torah. There were several times, and that's what we're going to try to cover today, where there was a certain finality, there was a certain organization of the pretty much representatives of the entire Jewish people, and they agreed that a change has to be made to the method, or else the transmission process is in doubt. And they did something that was, from then on, binding to every subsequent generation. Now, at the destruction of the Second Temple, so we have in between the First and Second Temple, we have 70 years. Those are the years where the story of Purim, for example, happened. The famous names are Ezra is a famous name that we know from that time. And they, that period, the end of the First Temple period, is really the beginning of what we know as exile. It's the beginning of the diaspora. Right? Before the destruction of the Second Temple, there was already, we know the story of 10,000 of the best and greatest and brightest leaders of the Jewish people were exiled to Babylon. And the Jewish people were freaking out because there was no one left. All the scholars, all the talented people were all sent off to Babylon. And the Talmud tells us this was a blessing in disguise, because the Almighty knew that there was going to be an exile. And the temples were destroyed, and civilization in Jerusalem was going to come to an end. The Jewish people would all be taken to Babylon. Therefore, he made that it was done incrementally in stages, that the first group of people were the best and brightest. They were brought over to exile in Babylon, and they established and developed a vibrant, flourishing Jewish society that when the masses of the Jewish people came after the destruction of the temple into the full-fledged exile, they already came, and it was already a dynamic Jewish community. They had shuls and mikvahs and everything.
How was that accomplished?
What do you mean?
Because, that the scholars or those folks went first.
We're first, yes.
I thought that it was all, the Jews were all driven out at the same time from Nebuchadnezzar, yeah.
Yes. Well, no. So there was. It was first 10,000, but then it was the masses of the Jewish people, hundreds of thousands.
Okay.
But this is already recorded in the book of Kings.
Okay.
The people that first go, is
Yes.
that before the destruction?
Yes.
So
Yes.
in
And
other
I can't remember
words,
how many years before.
somebody
10 or
did
20
because
years
they
before.
knew.
10 or 20 years before. And the Talmud says that this is another example of God intervening in Jewish history in a way that we cannot understand the value at the time of the intervention, but only in retrospect we can understand. Like, for example, the example for this is that imagine if all the best and brightest were suddenly just taken away. Like, you're now a nation bereft of its leaders. It's devastating. But the Almighty knows that this community is coming to an end. And if the Jewish people are exiled and they don't have a framework to live a Jewish life, they're at risk of destruction. So what the Almighty did, he took the 10,000 best and brightest, brought them ahead to Babylon. They were there to set up shop, so to speak, to prepare
Right.
for what's going to be a dynamic, flourishing Jewish community for millennia in Babylon. right? Up to this past century, there were Jewish people living in Iraq, right? That's what started then,
Right.
and it would be the center of Jewish life for 1,000 years. And it was established, and by the time the masses came, there was everything. There was yeshivas, there was Jewish schools, there were Jewish butcher shops, everything. Everything was there. Everything was there, ready. And another example, I'll give you a modern example. We look at the Zionist movement as being something so unlikely and so strange in the historical vision. Right? The Jewish people were always yearning to go back to Israel. Right? And in 1825, there was a major effort to try to make Grand Island near Niagara Falls, that would be the Jewish state. It wasn't
Really?
Herzl's idea.
Well, we heard about
Herzl-
Africa, somewhere in Africa.
Well,
right?
that's in 1905 in the
Right.
Zionist Congress. That was Herzl
Right.
was pushing for Uganda, right? But it was very unlikely, and it wasn't the first effort. And there was efforts before that, and it was an effort by someone who was totally estranged from Judaism, Theodor Herzl. Right? But there was a movement. The movement took steam because God was preparing for the Jewish people who had been in Europe for 1,000 years to be like that, exiled. Right? So, and after the exile, there was an entire movement with political and social and intellectual and everything. Everything was there ready for the new yeshuv, the new settlement in the state of Israel. And another example. Also, in hindsight, we see it. It's clear. In hindsight, we see that's just suddenly out of nowhere came this new movement of renewal of this passion to go back to Israel. Out of nowhere. But in retrospect, from 100 years later, we see how God is really playing this game of chess, preparing, right, taking the Jewish people, moving them one place to the other, but the seeds are already planted before the wound is inflicted.
When I
The
was
seeds
in
of
Israel,
healing are planted.
When I was
Yes.
in Israel, we went to Herzl's, the place where they had that Congress and all, and his burial place and everything, and I didn't know his whole story and how it ended with him. And I was totally surprised that we even honored him in any way.
Why is
But-
that?
Well, because he didn't really live as a Jew. He didn't.
Yeah,
his
well-
family,
well-
nobody was really Jewish.
Well,
But-
no one was. He didn't have any sort of Jewish descendants, and his kids committed
Right.
one committed suicide, one converted to Christianity. It was a sad, but he was Jewish, and he was a reawakened Jew because of his passion to develop the Jewish state. So he was someone
Oh,
who
so-
actually, yes,
okay, for
I
that
think he's
reason.
someone he's a remarkable person. Just it's an example of someone who has this flicker of
Yeah.
of Jewish spirit still there deep inside of him, even though it was just reawakened. It was just out of nowhere. And this is someone who dedicated his life and his health and all his money. He was a pretty wealthy guy. Everything invested in this idea.
Okay.
And yes, it's unlikely, and oftentimes we see that salvation comes from the most unlikely of sources. Any example, any part of the lineage, if you look of the Messiah of King David, is always up in the air, right? The story of Judah and Tamar. That's a very bizarre story. Like, it seems, like Judah's listening to a prostitute. What is going on? How about to be his daughter-in-law? And this is where God is planting the seeds of the Messiah, of David and Bathsheba. This is it. It's like the black eye of the Jewish people, and ends up being the brightest shining star. So yes, that's a pattern that we'll see again and again, that salvation will come from an unlikely source and as a surprise to a lot of people. Absolutely. Now, at the time of the destruction of the first temple, there was going to be a major upheaval in how the Jewish people operate as a nation. Prophecy is almost over. The last of the prophets we're dealing with, Ezra and Nehemiah, people, Malachi, people like that. But that's it. Prophecy is coming to an end. The Urim V'Tumim that we talked about, the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol, that's over. That was only the first temple. The Jewish people are now beginning to spread out. They're no longer just all situated in Israel. There's a Jewish community in Israel. There's a much bigger Jewish community in Babylon. Right? The Sanhedrin has to deal with its first rocky situation, because it's also being a victim of this upheaval. And there's going to be now the first major movement where Ezra and the men of the Great Assembly, the term you hear, the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, are going to institute many aspects of Jewish life the way we know it today to deal with this new reality of what it means to Jewish people after prophecy is going to end and the first temple and its miracles are going to end as well. So, for example, we have today tefillah, liturgy, prayers that were instituted by this expanded Sanhedrin. Right? The Sanhedrin went from 71 members to 120 members. The modern Israeli Knesset is modeled after the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the Great Assembly. The word Knesset. That's right. There's 120.
So
there's 120 members.
Still the Sanhedrin?
Yes, it was for about 100 years. It was I think it was exactly 98 years. It was an expanded Sanhedrin that was given the name Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, and they're the first time where we see innovations as a method to preserve Judaism in trying times. So, the example that I gave you is organizing the tefillot, the Shachris, Mincha, Ma'ariv. Additionally, they have the responsibility of canonizing the books of the Torah. So we say the Torah, we actually mean the Nevi'im and Kesuvim, the prophets and the writings. There's 24 books of the Tanakh, what's known as the Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Kesuvim is an acronym. And they were the ones that decided which books go in, which books come out, and when they finished and they gave their stamp on it, no other subsequent book could be added. So, for example, the book of the Maccabees, right, is a book that's part of the Christian canon, but it's not part of the Jewish canon, even though it was written, it seems like, by upstanding Jews, and it was the story of Hanukkah, but that came after the men of the Great Assembly closed the Hebrew canon, right, the canon of the Tanakh,
Right.
and therefore, no other books can be added. Yes?
The Tanakh is 24 books.
That's correct.
So this right here.
That's just the Torah.
This is the total Torah when it's in one book like this?
No,
Or is this
that's
a
the
bridge?
Torah. The Tanakh stands for Torah. It's one section, 5 books. Nevi'im, I believe it's 11 books. And Kesuvim, it says in the back. If you go to here, I'm sorry, I got it wrong. If you look at this pyramid on page 3 of your handouts, you'll see at the top of the pyramid, there's the Torah. There's the 5 books of the Torah.
Right.
Then there's the prophets, or in Hebrew it's called Nevi'im. Navi means a prophet, so think of the books of Samuel, Book of Kings, Book of Judges. That's part of 8 books, right? Book of Isaiah, Book of Ezekiel, Book of Jeremiah,
8.
right? That's 8. And then Kesuvim. Kesuvim means writings. So writings, we look like the books of the Chronicles, Book of Esther, Book of Ruth, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, right? Those books.
That's how many.
Tehillim, Psalms, Proverbs, 11.
Okay, so
Wait a minute, so it's 5 plus 8 plus 11, is that what you said?
we got
Yes.
5, 8, and then 11.
That's correct. So that's
All
13
together,
plus
yeah.
that's 24, exactly. So who decided what goes in? Who decided what goes out? That was the job of the men of the Great Assembly. And the last one that actually went in is the book of Esther. Now remember, as I mentioned, the story of Esther and Purim, that took place between the first and second temple era. So hence, when the men of the Great Assembly were organizing the Tanakh, it was very recently after the book of Esther was written, and that was the last book to be included in the Tanakh, in the Jewish Bible. Okay?
Okay, but when this, I hate to keep asking, but
I love the questions. Keep them asking.
when you say Tanakh, you're talking about all 24 books.
That's correct. Tanakh is an acronym.
So you're not
An acronym.
exactly, when you just said that went in to that book, it could be any one of these books that you're,
I'm sorry?
like you said about Esther. Esther went in,
Esther went into the Tanakh. Correct.
right, but which, she go into prophets?
She went
writing?
into writings. Into
Okay.
writings. Yes. It's part of the writings. Now, some of the books were compilations. It means like the book of Psalms had there's multiple authors to the book of Psalms. In fact, the book of Psalms, I think the Talmud says, has 10 authors. But it was collected, organized, edited by this assembly. The Anshe Knesset, men of the Great Assembly. So we think of the book of Psalms as being as the work of David. And then we read on Shabbos, Psalm 90, Tefillah LeMoshe Ish Elokim, a prayer to Moses, the man of God. Moses, we're talking about David. David's the author. Well, David is the author for a lot of it, right? But there are other authors as well, including Moses, including the sons of Korah, including a lot of people, Tefillah LeAsaf, a guy named Asaf, etc. Okay, so now we seem to have a more organized or a kind of a new world order, new Jewish world order. We have Ezra. Ezra comes back to Jerusalem. And the Jewish people were all moved to Babylon, and now Ezra led a group, I think it was 42,000 people, coming back to Israel. They got permission to build a temple, and only 70 years after the first temple was destroyed, the second temple's construction began. What's interesting about this is that even though the Jewish people had the license and the liberty to go back to Israel, the vast majority, the overall majority of them chose to remain in Babylon. And during the Second Temple era, up to the even after the Second Temple, up to the Second Temple era, we think of it as the year about the year 300 or 400 before the Common Era, till about 70 after the Common Era. Of the Common Era, and even up to the year 500, there was always going to be these two major Jewish communities, one of them in Israel and one of them in Babylon. Now, not to say that there weren't other communities, like the community in Yemen. There was a community that was there for many, many hundreds of years. Communities that began to go to Europe, Spain, and North Africa. But primarily, we have pretty much two major communities, and the Talmud tells constantly episodes of when this rabbi came. The rabbi came, where did he come from? Well, it means when he came from Israel to Babylon. That's what it means. And there was always this dialogue because you don't have internet or cell phones, right? We know that. So there was entire schools of thought, of study in Israel, and there was an ongoing parallel school of thought and study in Babylon. And they would have individuals that come back and forth. And the second you have some scholar coming from Israel, what do? You debrief them. You find out what they're saying, right? You find out what the teachings are, right? So the Talmud recounts when Rav Dimi came, where did he come from? He came from Israel and came to visit Babylon. And he came to walk to the yeshiva, and they started talking to him, and he would say this and he would say that. They would argue and back and forth. Talmud tells another story about there were colleagues who were split. One of them was in Israel, like Rav Yochanan was in Israel, and Rav was. They were at one point colleagues, and then one of them ended up in Babylon. One of them had stayed in Israel, and they would have. He had a student, and the student committed a crime, at least in the eyes of the Babylonians. There was a story about this Jewish guy. Crazy stories. This is a crazy story. This Jewish guy who was trying to set up, he was an informant, and he was informing people, informing the government that this guy has this money, and we know that the law of an informant is you're allowed to kill an informant in Jewish law. I don't want to get to the particular aspects of why, because he's considered a pursuer. Because the second he informs the government comes to take the guy's money, and then they say, "Where's your money?" And he says he gives them the money. He says, "Well, where's the rest of it?" And they end up shooting him. So in essence, someone who tries to inform the government about other people, even other people's money, much less their iniquities, they are. There may be situations where you're allowed to actually execute the pursuer before he goes to tell the government. That's the law. I don't want to get into it.
Before he tells.
Yes, that's the law.
Whistleblowers.
Well, not whistleblowers, but informants is a better word.
How about, can I just
Yes.
second ask this?
What
about in Israel today, if you had somebody who was...
I don't want to get too much. I don't want to get much sidetracked. This is the story. So there was this informant, and a big rabbi, then Rav Kahana came, he took a stick, and he hit the guy, and he killed him. And his teacher said, he lauded him, said, you did a wonderful mitzvah. Because that's what was the right thing to do. And doing the right thing was the mitzvah. But Babylonians will come after you, and they'll persecute you. Leave right now to Israel. And it tells a story. He says, go to Israel and go study by my old colleague Rabbi Yochanan. But you don't open your mouth for 7 years. Don't open your mouth for 7 years. So he goes there, and don't talk to Rabbi Yochanan for 7 years. So he goes there, and he goes, and he ends up, he makes the whole trip, and he gets to this yeshiva, it's a major yeshiva in Israel, Rabbi Yochanan, and everyone, there's a bustle of people, and he meets one of the students, says, where's Rabbi Yochanan? He just finished giving a class. So, fine. So he goes to Rabbi Yochanan's second in command. His name is Rish Lakish. And he says to him, what's the story? They start talking and learning, which is a term for, they were discussing Torah. And this Rav Kahanu, who just came in, this new immigrant, was just a master. He was just incredible. He just ate up everyone there. And, which is a theme you see a lot, that the people in Bavel were sharper than the ones in Israel. And Rabbi Lakish, so impressed, he runs over to his brother-in-law Rav Yochanan, who was the master, was really old, sage, venerated sage, and he tells him, Ari alami Bavel, a lion arose from Bavel, which is a famous line in the Talmud. He said, this new guy is amazing. Fine. So the next day, here's a new class, a new lecture he gives. So they caked Rav Kahana, the new guy from Bavel, they put him all the way in the front. There's 7 rows of students. He's all the way in the front. And Rabbi Yochanan starts giving a speech, and he's waiting for the guy to open up. This is the guy. He said, talk, but he remembers he was told he can't talk. So he says another thing. He doesn't say anything. And he says another thing. He doesn't say anything. So he goes over to Rish Lakish and says, wait a minute. This lion that you promised me turned into a fox. So he says, you're sitting in the front. You go sit in the back. He says, I'm all the way to the back of the room of Kahana. And he kind of says, these 7 rows that I was demoted, kind of, I was in the front of the line. Now I'm 7 rows. They should atone for the 7 years I was supposed to be quiet. He says, now I can start talking. So the rabbi says one thing, and he fights back. This is another thing, and he asks him questions, and he totally stumps the rabbi. And he says, the rabbi was sitting on six carpets, and every time Rav Kahana asked him a question he couldn't answer, he got off one carpet. Eventually, after 7 questions, the rabbi's sitting on the floor. This is a story in the Talmud. Pretty awesome. So Talmud mentions that Rav Yochanan, the teacher, was really old and he had big eyebrows, and his eyebrows would cover his eyes. He wasn't able to see. So he tells his students, I want to see this guy. I want to see him. So they came and they take these silver little things and they pick up his eyebrows, and he sees Rav Kahana kind of had a cleft lip. So he looked like he was smiling. Yes. Yeah. Or he wasn't able to see. So then they helped him see. He sees Rav Kahana had like some sort of disfigured and deformity.
Like a hairline.
And he said, this guy's laughing at me. And Rav Kahana died on the spot.
Who died on the spot?
The student, because he made Rabbi Yochanan upset. On the spot. The next day, they went to bury Rabbi Yochanan. It's an amazing story. Like, this is recorded. This is not just a story. We know the names of the people. We know where they lived. We know the progression of their students. We have dates. We have everything. We can go look here. If you look on page... Here. Page... the Unbroken Chain of Torah Transmission. You'll see the names of all these people. We know the names. We know where they lived. Number 37 is Rav. Rav was in Babylon. Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan. They were colleagues there at the same time. We know who these people are. Right? He dies. Right? He dies. And the next day Rabbi Yochanan says, did you see this guy? You see how he was mocking me? I said, no, he wasn't mocking you. That was just the way he is. Starts, he gets living a little crazy. I'm like, when I learned this story, I'm like, whoa, this is a story, right? So he's like, what? I got upset at him and that caused him to die. So what happens next is this: I'm going to his grave. He goes to his grave, and he sees that there's a snake around the grave, and the snake's tail is in his mouth, forming a complete circle around the grave, not letting Rabbi Yochanan approach. So he says to the snake, he says, "Listen, I want to go approach my student Rav Kahana." The snake doesn't relent. Because I want to go to approach my colleague, my peer, Rav Kahana. Doesn't let him go. So I want to go approach my Rebbe, my teacher, Rav Kahana. He lets him go through. Rabbi Yochanan prays, and guess what? Rav Kahana coming back to life.
I knew this was going to happen.
Wait, don't finish.
No, I'm serious.
Rav Kahana comes back to life. He starts asking him all his questions. Right? And then there's a little bit of a disagreement as to what exactly happened, because the Talmud is a little bit ambiguous as to what it means. According to one interpretation, Rav Kahana tells him, I'll come back to life only if you assure me that I'll never die again. According to the other interpretation is, it seems like there's a disagreement as to whether or not he actually came back to life or he just died that was it, he died. But either way, it gives you a picture of, first of all, what kind of life they lived. Like, there was a vibrant Torah study. And there was these different communities, one in Israel, one in Babylon, but also the magnitude of the people. Like the Talmud, it doesn't blink an eye at the fact that Rabbi Yochanan would get upset, and if he got upset, then anyone who upset him would just turn into a heap of bones. Of course, like this is someone that's beyond our capacity. Like we can't even. There's scholars that have lived in the past 100 years that are so beyond our capacity we can't even. In our eyes, they're angels. Go back 2,000 years. The people like Rabbi Yochanan, people like Rav and Rav Kahana, they're so beyond, and the Talmud doesn't flinch at a story of him resuscitating the dead. It's not a big deal. And there's many stories like that in the Torah. These were titans of men. And the fact that he resuscitated the dead, no big deal. Okay? The fact that Moses split the sea, that was a big deal, because Moses didn't have Torah. The Talmud gives us several stories. I believe one of them is about Reb Pinchas ben Yair, one of the Tanaim who lived 2,000 years ago, who split the sea as well. So one of the commentators asked, wait a minute, what's the big deal that Moses split the sea? Big deal. 1,300 years later, they also split the sea. It was commonplace. They resuscitated the dead. No big deal. So the answer is that they had a Torah. The big deal about Moses doing all the miracles was pre-Torah. They didn't get the Torah yet.
He had God.
That's a miracle. When someone has Torah, the Torah is the blueprint of the world. If you have Torah, the world is subject to you. The world is subject to you. The rules of the world are subject to you. Someone's supposed to die. What does that mean? If you have Torah, the Torah comes before. Torah supersedes the world and the rules of the world. It's no big deal. Once you have Torah, it could be no big deal for you to resuscitate the dead, split the sea. No, it's not a big deal. Moses pre-Torah, that's a miracle. That's a miracle. Where were we?
You were talking about the two major communities, that one was in Israel
Yes.
and one was Babylon.
Yes.
That's how we got off
And yeah. So we mentioned Ezra and the man of the greatest assembly. They established the first major innovation. They gave some sort of framework for a new kind of Judaism. There's no prophecy. We don't have easy ways to answer things. Right? There's also going to be exile now. Right? We can't just rely on the temple being kind of a center point of Jewish practice. Everyone has to start saying prayers on their own. And yet the actual Torah and the laws of the Torah was still maintained in its oral fashion. And like we said, there was these dynamic, vibrant yeshivas in Babylon and in Israel where everything was kept fresh and maintained, and we still had the Sanhedrin. If you fast forward to after the destruction of the second temple, and 150 so years later, it's already coming to the end of the days of the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin, they were in Israel, they were always in the temple. 40 years before the destruction of the temple, right, they moved elsewhere, to Yavne. The Talmud recounts the different places that they went. They were a group that was torn away from its permanent location. They were going from place to place, and there was a threat that they would be disbanded. The second they're disbanded, the last stalwart of Jewish central leadership would be over. Now, what happens when you don't have centralized leadership, when you don't have the greatest Torah scholars assembled to be able to answer your questions? What could possibly happen to the accuracy of the Torah? Within a few hundred years, you may have different versions, different understandings, and you'll have different religions.
Right.
That's why about 110 or 20 years after the destruction of the first temple, there was a man who is central, like Ezra, central. He made the next major innovation, and his name was Rabbi Judah the Prince, otherwise known as Rebbe. If you open up a book of Mishnah and say, Rebbe says, wait a minute, there was a lot of rabbis. Right. Who's this one rabbi? He's just called Rabbi. He was assigned by the Jewish people the title Rabbi, because he's the rabbi of everyone. Because he is the one who had the foresight, had the capabilities, had the political connections, and had the enormous wealth, and was perfectly situated at a time where the Roman leadership was friendly. He was friendly with Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, who was the emperor at the time, and he was able to assemble 1,000 rabbis and to collect all of the laws of the Torah and organize them and canonize them and set them into writing for eternity. And he was the one who codified the Mishnah. The Mishnah is a collection of 63 books organized into, you'll have this over here on your sheets here. Collection of 63 books. Well, if you email us, we'll give it to you. 63 books organized into 6 sections. A section on agriculture, a section on laws of the holidays. Like there's a book of Shabbos, there's a book of Sukkot, there's a book of Purim, there's a book on Passover, there's a book on Rosh Hashanah, right? Okay. More of the holidays. There's on marriage and divorce and women. It's called Nashim. There's a book of damages, all interpersonal law, all property law, all criminal law, all of that. Law of jurisprudence, holiness, like the laws of the temple and all the sacrifices in the temple, and purity and impurity, the laws of purity and impurity, which are things which are not so much relevant to us because we don't really live in a time where the state of the purity is that pertinent to our life, with the exception of the laws of Nida, which is still very, very important for the way we live, but with the destruction of the temple, a lot of what Judaism is and the laws of Judaism is not relevant to us. But it's still there and it's still preserved for eternity. And after the Mishnah was organized, after it was codified, after it was set into writing by Rabbi Judah the Prince and his collection, a collaboration of all the rabbis, it's set in stone. And no future generation can in any way question, and they're all subject to it. They're all subject to it.
So
that's why.
Like all the commentaries and stuff off of it?
Now, the Mishnah is just the laws. It's not any of the interpretation of the laws, or the sources of the laws, or the reasoning of the laws, or the exceptions of the laws. Everything else that goes around it. It's just a very short, concise, succinct, brief law. That's the Mishnah.
They're just statements. So that means that those laws can't be changed, right?
Cannot
be changed.
And
right.
Anything that comes afterwards has to fit into that framework. Just like when Moses gave us the Torah, the written Torah, right? It's a final word. None of it can be changed, right? And anything that you say afterwards has to fit in to the written Torah. So too, at the time of the Mishnah, anything that comes subsequently has to fit into the Mishnah. So you'll see many, 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 many times in the Talmud, 300 years later we have the Talmud. The Talmud is the same thing as the Mishnah, but for everything else of the oral Torah. Not just the laws, but all the elaboration of the laws, all the sources of the laws, all the exceptions of the law, all the applications of the law. It basically takes this very concise Mishnah and expands it to every other aspect of it. And oftentimes in the Talmud, it's a very vibrant, there's lots of narrative, lots of dialogue, but oftentimes one of the questions that would be asked about of an Amora, is one of the rabbis in the Talmudic times, one of the questions that will typically be asked to him is, wait a minute, how do you say that doesn't fit in with a certain Mishnah? Because after the Mishnah was finalized, everything else has to fit into the Mishnah. So, if you're a rabbi that comes after the Mishnah, and you say a statement, a teaching, and that's incompatible with a Mishnah, then your teaching is discarded. unless you could defend it. You could say, and how would you defend it? You would say, I have an alternative understanding of that Mishnah. Hence, my teaching still fits in with the Mishnah. Or you could say that this Mishnah is in dispute. And what I'm saying is only in accordance with a different Mishnah. I'm just saying my position in a different Mishnah, in accordance with the Mishnah, which is in dispute with this Mishnah that you're saying is a question to me.
Now, isn't that part of the discourse that goes on?
And all that's the Talmud.
It's all that
Yeah.
conversation. And
So you'll see a Mishnah, and then I'll say a rabbi says, how do you say that? That's just doing the Mishnah. And he says, no. I learned our Mishnah this way. Or he can say, no. There's a dispute amongst the different Mishnahs, and I'm saying my position in accordance with a different Mishnah. I'm not arguing this Mishnah. I'm explaining a different Mishnah.
Gotcha. Okay.
And the two Mishnahs are allowed to argue because they're on par with each other, right? Now, once we have the Mishnah and we have the Talmud, we are still missing something. That what we're missing is halacha. We're missing what to do when you have a dispute in the Talmud. You have two Mishnahs, and there's a disagreement. Or you have two Gemaras, two Talmuds, and there's a disagreement. What about halacha? What do you actually do? That was not necessarily always so clear from the Talmud. Even though the Talmud itself gives it gives us rules for it's self-governing. It gives us rules of how we apply. Like, for example, we have rules saying that we go after majorities. It's the easiest rule. We know that there's a majority rules. So if there's 500 rabbis saying one thing and one rabbi saying the other thing, we go with the majority. There's other rules governing when you have an individual disagreement. Beis Shammai, the students of Shammai, students of Hillel, we go with Hillel, with 18 exceptions. Yeah. And what those exceptions are, we know that. But to organize that and to codify that and to write that down, that was a task that was given to later generations. I want to read to you here, very importantly, from the Rambam. The Rambam lived in the 12th century, so 1135 to 1204. And he wrote one of the most influential books in the next stage of taking the Talmud, which is the Mishnah and the Gemara, right? And organizing it in for halacha, for us, in a practical way.
What's
And he
Gemara?
says,
Did I miss that?
Gemara and Talmud is the same word.
Okay.
Sorry. From the time of Moshe, it's a little bit long, but it's kind of what I just said. So I'll read it quickly, and you guys could you'll see how what I got was from this. From the time of Moshe until Rabbi Judah the Prince, no one had written a work from which the oral Torah was publicly taught. Publicly, no one had made the final word of the law. Rather, in each generation, the head of the court or the prophet at the time wrote down for his private use notes on the tradition he heard from his teachers, and he taught in public from memory. So too, each individual, every there were students. It was vibrant, right? There was yeshivas, and people taught their children, and wholesale knowledge of Torah was ever present. Right? The Jewish people were rife with scholars, and every individual wrote down, according to his ability, parts of the explanation of the Torah and of its laws that he had heard, as well as new matters that developed in each generation, which he had not received by tradition. Right? Such had always been done until the time of Rabbi Judah the Prince. He gathered together all the traditions, all the enactments, and all the explanations and interpretations he heard from Moses, our teacher, or had been deduced by the courts of all the generations in all matters of the Torah, and he wrote the book of Mishnah from all of them. And he taught it in public, and it became known to all of Israel. Everyone wrote it down and taught it everywhere, so that the oral Torah would not be forgotten. Remember, we said, this was a time when the Sanhedrin was already at its last days. The second temple was destroyed. The Jewish people were further fragmented and splintered. The danger of destruction of the Jewish people via destruction of the Torah was imminent. That's why Rabbi Judah Prince did what he did. Says that, I'll read again from the Rambam. And why did Rabbi Judah Prince do so? and did not leave the matter as it had been. Good question. Why did he innovate? Because he saw that the students were becoming fewer and fewer. Calamities were continually happening. Wicked government was extending its domain and increasing its power. And the Israelites were wandering and reaching remote places. So there's a time of governmental restrictions. There was exile. There was calamities. There were fewer students. And thus, he wrote a book to serve as a handbook for all, so that it could be rapidly studied and would not be forgotten. Throughout his life, he and his court continued giving public instruction in the Mishnah.
Now, this is Rambam or
Well, Rambam is talking. He's giving a history. Rambam,
not the Jew?
he's giving a history and he's talking about Rabbi Judah the Prince. Correct. Because later on he's going to explain how he fits it. He fits it.
All right.
And then he moves on. He gives a list of all the students of Rabbi Judah the Prince. He talks about Rabbi Yochanan. We met Rabbi Yochanan, right? Although these 11, I skipped a paragraph. He mentions 11 students of Rabbi Judah the Prince. Although these 11 received from Rabbi Judah the Prince and attended his house of study, Rabbi Yochanan was young at the time and later was a student of Rabbi Yanai, received the Torah from him. Rav, we mentioned Rav and Rabbi Yochanan were colleagues. One of them was the one, right? Also received from Rabbi Yanai, and Shmuel, who was the third colleague. And Rav wrote the Sifra, so they added Rav Sifra and Sifri, etc. And he goes on, he lists all the rabbis up to Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi was the one who wrote down the Talmud. Ravina Rav Ashi was the last of the authoritative sages of the Talmud. It was Rav Ashi who wrote the Babylonian Talmud in the land of Babylon, about 100 years after Rabbi Yochanan wrote the Jerusalem Talmud in Israel. Well, what's the Talmud? I'm sorry for going through this really quickly, but I think I've kind of covered a lot of it, so I'm just going to read what he says. The subject matter of the two Talmuds is the interpretation of the text of the Mishnah and the explanation of its depths and the manners that developed in the various courts from the time of Rabbi Judah the Prince until the writing of the Talmud. From the two Talmuds and from the Tosefta, from the Sifra and the Sifri, there's other books, contemporary books, and from the Toseftot, from them all are to be found what is forbidden and what is permitted, what is clean, what is unclean. Right? So he's trying to say there's a lot of information out there. And from all of it, you have everything. I'll quote it again. From the two Talmuds, and from the Tosefta, and from the Sifra, and from the Sifri, which are contemporary books, and from the Tosefta, from all of them are to be found what is forbidden and what is permitted. How do you live as a Jew? What is halacha? What do you do? Right? What is clean and what is unclean? What is liable? What is exempt? What is fit for use? What is unfit for use? According to the unbroken oral tradition from Moses, from Sinai. And he says that besides for the law, there's custom, there's legislation, there's fences. He gives a whole list here. After the court, and I skipped a bunch of paragraphs, after the court of Rav Ashi, who wrote down the Talmud, in the time of his son and completed it, means his son Mar Bar Rav Ashi, he finished the job, the people of Israel were scattered throughout all the nations, most exceedingly, and reached the most remote parts and distant islands. And armed struggle became prevalent in the world, and the public ways became clogged with enemies. So that thoroughfare connecting the various different communities, that stopped, that we mentioned in our story. The study of Torah declined, and the people of Israel ceased to gather in places of study in their thousands and myriads as they had been before. I'm skipping a few more lines here. Just trying to get the highlights here. I know, because it's so valuable. You know, whatever is in the Babylonian Talmud is binding on all of the people of Israel, and every city and town is forced to observe all the custom observed by the Talmud sages, and to enact their restrictive legislations, and to observe their positive legislations. It goes about the Gaonim. Okay. Now, sorry if I'm doing this to you. I'm like reading and reading. But I think it's really valuable, so I'll just keep on reading.
It's a lot.
Now, my mind is talking about his generation. In our time, severe troubles came one after another. All are in distress. The wisdom of our sages has disappeared, and the understanding of our discerning men is hidden. So there's been a decline also in the quality of the leaders. Thus, the commentaries, the responses to questions, and the set of laws that the Gaonim wrote, Gaonim was the period after the Talmud, which had once seemed clear, have in our times become hard to understand, so that only a few properly understand them, and one hardly needs to mention the Talmud itself. the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, the Sephra, the Sefri, and the Tosefta, all which require a broad mind, a wise soul, and considerable time before one can correctly know from them what is forbidden or permitted and the other rules of the Torah. What he's saying is a very important idea. The Talmud contained everything you need to know. It's all there. But people can't draw it out from there. Because they don't have the time to study the entire Talmud.
Or they didn't
Right?
understand
They're
how
not,
to do it.
right? This is where Maimonides fits in. For this reason, this is the introduction of Maimonides.
TMI, too much information.
Yeah, I know.
No, I mean,
Yeah.
the people have.
Yeah, it's too much information, and it's very difficult information. And it's a lot. For this reason, Moshe, the son of Maimon, hence Maimonides, the Sephardi, found that the current situation is unbearable, and so, relying on the help of the Almighty, I intensely studied all these books. For I saw fit to write what can be what can be determined from all these words in regard to what is forbidden and permitted and unclean and clean and the other rules of the Torah. Everything in clear language and terse style, so that the whole oral law will be thoroughly known to all, without bringing problems and solutions or different points of view, but rather clear, convincing, and correct statements in accordance with the laws big word, from all these words and commentaries that have appeared from the time of our holy teacher, who is a reference to Rabbi Judah the Prince, to the present.
So this is the Mishnah Torah.
So,
This is the
exactly.
Mishnah
So what Maimonides is saying like this, let me just rephrase everything he just said, basically. What he's saying is like this: I'm going to give you the book to end all books. I'm going to give you the book in a very clear, and he writes a little further. He says, all you need is the Torah, 5 books of Moses, and my book.
And that.
Because I'll give you all the Mishnah, and all the Talmud, and all the Gonim, and everything, all the customs, everything.
What's his book called?
It's called the Mishnah Torah.
I have to tell you something. I read a biography of Maimonides.
Yeah.
And it talks about in this biography, Betty, about how the rabbis, some of the other leaders of the day, trashed this guy like
Yes,
crazy. They were
yes.
so mad at
I'd
him
love to read that.
because they said to him, "How dare you tell people that they don't have to study the Talmud? All they got to do is read the 5 books and your Mishnah Torah."
It's a fierce debate whether or not the right. I'll read you what he says here.
I shouldn't interrupt anymore, but I just read this not too long ago. And
I have called this work the complete restatement of the Torah, Mishnah Torah. For a person reads the written Torah first and then reads this book and knows from it the entire oral Torah without needing to read any other book between them. It doesn't say that the Rambam is trying to say that you don't, that you shouldn't, or that he doesn't, he's just saying that you could learn all of what you need to do.
here, yeah.
Exactly. He's not saying not to learn the rest of the Talmud.
I mean, he was really criticized by some people.
That being
for
said,
going to
the
this.
Rambam is one of the people that personify the next stage of the development of the Torah, where it's taking everything, like he said, taking everything and organizing it in a structured way. Now, the book that you mentioned, Mishnah Torah, that is organized in a very interesting way. How is it written? Like, where does it start? Is it written? So we find in that period, we find 4 different methods of organizing the information. For example, we find the Tur. The Tur lived a few 100 years after Rambam, maybe a little more than that, and he organized it by the day. So the first thing he writes is what to do when you wake up in the morning. That's how he starts it. What do you do when you wake up in the morning? The Tur. The Tur is one of the commentaries in the Rambam's class. You have the Rush. He writes it as a commentary on the Talmud. So it's in the order of the Talmud. You find the Chinuch. The Chinuch writes it in the order of the Torah. So from Genesis to Deuteronomy. Maimonides, interestingly, writes in the order of importance. So he starts off with the most important principle and seems to end with the least important principle. From start to finish. Who determined what's more important? He did. And hence he organized his book in a way that was never seen or done till then. And his vision was for this to be the book that answers all questions. And he was right and he was wrong. He was right because it was the book, but it didn't actually answer any questions. Actually, it just brought up more. Why? Because other people followed suit. He wasn't the only one to do that. He was the most famous one to do that. But if you went 300 years after the Rambam, now what you have is the same problem. You have the same problem in a more evolved fashion. you have the words of the Rambam, but you have also the words of Rabbi Alfasi and the Rosh and the Tur and the Rami Rottenberg and all the Rishonim, and they all wrote. It was a time of tremendous scholarship, a time where even though there was major upheavals in the Middle Ages, the medieval times, in the Jewish people and the world, right? A time of tremendous challenge and inquisition, exile, crusades, all those things, and we have a very, very vibrant Torah and voluminous writings from the rabbis of that time. In fact, there's a group of rabbis called the Balei Tosafot, who were grandchildren of Rashi. Rashi was also from that time period. And they wrote so much, and there was one time that they were stuck in a cave, hiding out from their oppressors, and they had no pen or ink. And they cut themselves,
seriously.
and they took their blood, and they kept on writing. That was their dedication towards writing. So after this period, think of the year 1500, you have an enormous volume of content. And once again, if you just open up your eyes and say, where do I start? Right, you're mystified. So the next thing that we find is, once again, another effort to organize it all. We find it was a two-tiered effort called a Shulchan Aruch, which is a short version of the Bet Yosef, which is a more longer version, where he picks sides and settles disputes amongst the Rishon, amongst the group of scholars of Maimonides' era. And he writes what became the authoritative text of Jewish law, called the Shulchan Aruch. It has in it the commentaries of, not the commentaries, but the Shulchan Aruch means a set table. And it has in it what's a book called the Tablecloth, which is, if you open up a Shulchan Aruch today, you'll see that it's kind of weaved together. It's really two books weaved into one. One of them is called the set table, one of them is the tablecloth, the mappa. And that became accepted by the entirety of the Jewish people as the authoritative work of Jewish law, incorporating all of the opinions of all the Rishonim. Rishonim means first ones, and they are referenced to the scholars from the year 1000 to the year 1500, roughly. They like Rashi, Alfasi. No, the year 1000 to the year 1500. Names like Rabbi Alfasi, Rashi, Rabbi Nissim, Rashba, Ritva. There's lots and lots of names. Maimonides is probably the most famous of them all. Nachmanides as well, Tur, Rosh, etc. So what they did is they organized that, and that's what we have today, till this day, as the authoritative book of Jewish law. And not to say that it ended there. There was many commentaries written on the Shulchan Aruch, and in fact, Maimonides, like we see if you read from his introduction, seemed to want to be the book that ends all books, but in fact, it's the book that has the most books written on it, more than anyone in history. In fact, it averages nowadays.
Sums us up in
Nowadays, on an average year, there's 300 new books published on the Rambam's book. And that's a testament to the lasting legacy and the impact that this book has had. And similarly, the Shulchan Aruch. There's also hundreds of books written a year on that because it's updated and refreshed and honed further and further. Now, last point I want to say is that you think of this progression. I think we get a very good picture of how the Torah is progressing. You think of it, I think there's a danger of thinking of it as it breaking down, so to speak, as if there's just more and more disagreement and more. In fact, what it actually is honing sharper and sharper.
More clarification, right? Basically.
Well, more clarification, but like Maimonides says, clarification because we need the clarification because we don't have the same intelligence or the same dedication or the same purity of mind, right? Like he mentions, we're not as wise. I'll read his words again. Because we are not a broad mind, a wise soul, considerate time. What's actually happening as we progress is where the early generation would give a more broad picture, because it was understood that once you had this broad picture, you actually knew everything else. It still maintained the requirement of of knowledge. Means that the oral Torah was kind of given incrementally. First, it was just the laws, right? True to the prince, just the laws. Everything else was still maintained in its oral fashion. Right? The 300 years later, right, the degradation of the situation of the study progressed. More was written down. More was revealed, so to speak. Right? Later on, the halacha was also revealed. Right? And we have also a wide picture of what halacha is, and the various perspectives on it. And we have disagreements in very, very specific and minute aspects of laws. But in the general characteristic, what the general law is, that is never in doubt, never in dispute. And that's always agreed upon, and we're just honing further and sharpening further our understandings of. Like, for example, last night, today's Wednesday night. Tuesday night, I was in the shul here in Israel, and there was a scholar from the neighborhood, and he was asked. We were talking about a halachic question. What was the question? Ready? Listen, how fine we're talking about. Friday night we make kiddush. Matzah Shabbos, after Shabbos we make havdalah.
Right.
His question to me was like this. There is an opinion that says that the mitzvah of Kiddush is of biblical origin and not rabbinic origin. Similarly, there is an opinion that says that Havdalah on Matzah Shabbos, after Shabbos, is also biblical and not rabbinic. Now, in the opinion that says that Friday night Kiddush is biblical, there is an opinion that says that it's also a biblical commandment to drink wine, and there is a prohibition of giving the wine to anyone else. Therefore, ask the question, if so, how do we, during the 9 days, or during the 9 days between the beginning of the month of Av till Tisha B'Av, we know there's a restriction on a non-Shabbos to consume wine, and therefore Matzah Shabbos, after Shabbos of Tisha B'Av, you make Havdalah on the wine. What do you do with the wine? You have to give it to a child. Well, according to the opinion that says that it's of biblical origin, and perhaps the wine consumption part of it is also of biblical origin, and a parallel example to that, in the opinion that says that Friday night Kiddush, the wine is also of biblical origin, you're not allowed to give it to children. How do you give the wine on this particular Matzah Shabbos to children? Now, tell me. Does that sound like a core principle of Judaism? No. It's not.
But you argued for how long?
It was a nice, vigorous discussion. Because it's a very, very delicate, fine, and specific
to the rest of the world,
aspect
that's
of
why.
Yeah.
You know, you can understand when you start to learn this stuff. How people can
Right.
study a lifetime and still,
I
you know.
never get
And
there.
so here I am,
Yeah.
Trying to learn
Well,
stuff.
what
It's
about
just like
me? You know,
unbelievable. Well, you
but
probably
that's not it.
Yeah, but
you've been doing it probably longer than I
No,
have. I mean,
I
just,
But
don't.
I think
Never
I think the lesson
Unbelievable.
for us is number one. I think the most important lesson is that we live and die with the Torah. Jewish people live and die with the Torah, and I think it's a very fair history of the Jewish people when we give the history of the Torah. Because what's the most important thing that we have is the Torah, and that's how we're defined. And the second we lose that, we lose who we are as individuals.
When
Yeah.
And
can see easily
the
how
premium that
different
we have placed over
thanks
the
to
years.
Torch. I mean,
Well, Torch.
I never put it all together. I didn't.
Yeah. So what we tried to do tonight was to give the briefest of pictures of the whole. Like we said, like last time, we did for Perspective of Jewish History. It's a glance. It's a sketch.
Right.
Because if you want to go, you could either take one afternoon and talk about a specific year in history and go very fine, or you have a broad picture and you see kind of like the big, kind of like the forest, right? Either you examine the tree or examine the forest, right?
Exactly.
The worst thing is we try to do like a half, you can't have a very long discussion about all the individual trees of a forest, right? That's too much,
My not a question, but a
right?
Right.
Either you discuss one tree or you discuss the entire forest.
Right. I just have a statement to make that
Yes.
when my husband passed away 3 years ago, and I had just started studying with Torch when he went into the home, so it was about 4 years ago. And my son Joshua, of course, is from these guys.
These guys. What do you mean?
Well, you know,
We're family.
He's
No,
observant.
no.
He's
learns
observant.
What these guys?
Yeah, okay, but what I'm trying to say,
He's observant.
right?
Our
observant,
guys.
Yeah.
But
We're one
he
family.
ascribes to the same set of beliefs.
No, Betty. We all subscribe to the same beliefs.
Okay.
He
Well,
observes.
observe.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's all
That's
So
about
anyway,
observance.
questions came up while my husband was in the hospital.
Yeah.
And every 2 minutes, my son was on the phone with a different rabbi in a different part of the country on this thing, and I go, on that thing, and I go, wait a minute, I don't understand. He's the expert on this problem, whether we can put the pacemaker in or not put the pacemaker, whether the thing that you have signed at the hospital for end of life, whatever you call that.
DNR.
That was a different rabbi, and you know, I just thought it was like amazing that he knew all these different people, and he dialed a phone number, and he went, Rev so-and-so, this is the situation I'm having here. I'm at the hospital, and my father's sick, and this is what's going on, and I was like, oh
But this is another example of the kind of study that we need to do today, where you have to take also new scenarios and new technological realities and try to superimpose what the core immutable principle of Jewish law is into a brand new thing that wasn't around the Talmud.
Can I ask you a question
Yes.
now? Is it usual then today for different rabbi scholars to focus in and become expert in certain areas?
Yes, that's
it
common.
is. That's
yeah,
what goes on.
Yeah, that's
hey, I don't know.
I didn't
don't
know that at the time.
I'm
only
only 3.5 years learning this stuff. So
Right,
I've got,
I was
you know.
that was 3.5, 4 years ago, and
So that's
and
what
I didn't
happens.
know that, and
Okay.
I was kind of amazed at it, and yet it was real. And then he would put me on the phone, and I feel like my God, it's like talking to God. I don't know this man, and he says this man is the foremost authority on this subject, and I'm going, hi, this is Betty Schwing. But it was
Now,
very
see, I didn't
interesting.
know that. I did not know that. I didn't know that that's what happens.
I remember Rabbi Wolbe telling us once that he talked about that,